Hello again, and welcome back to the Ramsay Online Lecture Series for 2020. I'm Simon Haynes, and my guest today is going to take us somewhere completely different from where we found ourselves so far during this series, which has in fact been not just a lecture series for 2020, but one that's about 2020. Our distinguished speakers up to now have concerned themselves with the present, with this strange and difficult year, and with some of the alarming internal and external problems confronting our civilization right now. But today, we're going to travel back in time over 3,000 years, and quite literally follow in the footsteps of perhaps the most celebrated of all travelers from our myths and legends, namely Odysseus or Ulysses. Now, of course, this doesn't make the story the slightest bit less significant or less real than the ones about the present. After all, our principal function at the Ramsay Centre is to point out that the past is alive in us, that we are these stories and experiences and ideas, and if we forget them, we forget who we are. All of which is exactly what our guide to the wanderings and adventures of our hero will be telling us now. And what a guide she is. Professor Bettany Hughes is a multiple award-winning historian, classicist, author, and broadcaster. Her speciality is ancient and medieval history and culture. She's taught and lectured at Oxford, Cambridge, many other universities, and has recently joined that visionary and innovative institution, the New College of the Humanities in Bedford Square in London, as the Professor of History. Professor Hughes's first book, which was a bestseller, On Helen of Troy, was published 15 years ago, has now been translated into 10 languages. Her second book, on Socrates, Athens, and the Search for the Good Life, was another bestseller. Her third, Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, published in 2017, has already been translated into 12 languages. Her latest book, just out, looks at the life story of Venus, the goddess of love. And she's currently writing a book on the 7 wonders of the world. Bettany Hughes has written and presented over 50 TV and radio documentaries for the BBC, Channel 4, Netflix, Discovery, PBS, the History Channel, National Geographic, BBC World, and ITV. Her 2 landmark BBC Open University series on Socrates, the Buddha and Confucius, and on Freud, Nietzsche and Marx can now be seen on Netflix. They are called Genius of the Ancient World and Genius of the Modern World, respectively. Her programs have now been seen by over 250 million people worldwide. Her academic, fiction, and public broadcasting awards are too numerous to mention here, but I will single out the Norton Medlicott Medal for Services to History in 2012, and the prestigious Helena Vaz de Silva Prize for Promoting Public Awareness of Cultural Heritage in 2018. Bettany Hughes was the first woman ever to receive this award. And last year, she was awarded the OBE for Services to History. I should mention finally that 2 integral and recurring themes in Professor Hughes's career, as those book titles suggest, have been to draw attention to the role of women in society throughout history and to promote the study of classical languages and civilizations in schools. The Ramsay Centre is indeed very fortunate to have this most eminent scholar and broadcaster acting as our guide to, and this is her title, The Odyssey, Odysseus's journey and his women.
How lovely it is to see all of you. And I'm so sorry that in this age when we're being asked to be on our screens the whole time, I'm communicating to you through a screen. But I'm really looking forward to coming to Australia in person. I cannot wait for the moment when we're allowed to be back in a shared space together, face to face, sharing ideas. The one comfort I do draw from the fact that we're having to use all of this technology through this current challenging time is that if you look at the actual words word techne, which is the Greek root of technology, which means an aptitude or skill, and go back in time to prehistory, to around 6,000 years ago, that word techne actually has a Proto-Indo-European root tech, which means to weave together. So my heartfelt hope is that by meeting technologically like this, we are actually having a meeting and a mingling of minds and ideas. So what I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today is the Odyssey, is Odysseus and his journey and his women. And there's a very particular reason why I wanted to share this with you now. A few months ago, I have to say, just pre-COVID, or kind of BC as it's being called, I had this very bright idea that what I wanted to do was to go on the trail of the Greek hero Odysseus, wily Odysseus, as he's described, this great fighter and warrior and thinker who fought in the Trojan War for 10 years and then spent 10 years on his own Odyssey trying to make it home. So I thought it'd be very interesting to try to follow in his watery path from what is today modern day Turkey, from the coastline there, just beneath Troy, down to the west of Greece to Odysseus's home island of Ithaka. Now, this felt like a very good idea. It was quite an adventure, quite a journey, 1,700 miles. I visited 22 historical sites and 13 islands, and I very much had my own adventures on the way, but there was a real reason for doing this. Firstly, I think it was really because I wanted to try to understand and investigate the extraordinary archaeology that is emerging for the Bronze Age, from the age around 3,500 years ago. When I think Odysseus' story is set, when I think the Trojan War, I don't think the Trojan War happened, but when I think the tales of Troy are first initiated, and then they're set down in the Iron Age. So I wanted to go and investigate these remarkable discoveries, really trying to piece together the story of this extraordinary world, which is in many ways the basis in both East and West for civilization as we know it. So there was a very practical reason for going. There was a slightly whimsical reason for going. In a way, this was living history to try to understand what it would have been like for men in small boats, in small wooden boats, to make a heroic journey like that. Because in a way, the Odyssey is, of course, the ultimate quest. And then there was a bigger purpose, to see why those stories, those myths, those legends live on, to see what relevance they have to us today, to see why they are so tenacious in our 21st century world. Because if you think about it, Odysseus and his colleagues really are with us all of the time. We use their world in our everyday language. We talk about people having a weak spot or an Achilles heel. Hopefully nobody here suffers from an Oedipus complex, where when you fall in love with your mother, but we often talk about Greeks bearing gifts. If we're lucky, we have the Midas touch, the touch of turning everything that we look at and touch into gold. And of course, I'm sure that we have all been mentors or have been mentored. And mentor was a real character in Odysseus's story. He's one of Odysseus's oldest friends, and he helps to look after Odysseus's young son, Telemachus, to guide and to inspire him, because of course Odysseus has left his family for 20 years, 10 years besieging Troy, and then 10 years making his own extraordinary Odyssey home. Odyssey itself, of course, is a word that we get from Odysseus. It comes from Odysseus' name, and it means an epic, a gargantuan journey. And epic, of course, is a Greek word too. Epic originally comes from the word epos, which means a story with purpose, a story with meaning. And then it comes to mean an epic poem, a long narrative poem. So a poem like the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus, first set down, we think, by Homer, and its prequel, the Iliad, the story of the Trojan War. And there are other epic poems from this extraordinary time in the deep past, the Epic of Gilgamesh from the Middle East too. So an epic is really a thing that matters, a thing that has tenacity and purpose and potency. And I should probably just warn you, if you don't already know this, that I really do believe the stories and ideas and experiences of the past matter to us past today. I am a passionate historian in every sense. I think that whereas we should never live in the past, we are fools if we don't admit that we live with it. And I'm with the great ancient author Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who tells us that history is philosophy, living by example. I believe this really strongly. Of course, my archaeological and historical colleagues, for decades, we've been talking about the power of history, even when it's unfashionable, that how can it not be of use when it's something where we use history to investigate ideas, the lived experience, the gaps in the story of the world, where we interrogate very finely what it is that people do when they live, how they live, and why. And it feels like to draw all of that to inform our present world is an opportunity missed if we don't dive into that extraordinary reservoir of truth, of untruths, and of ideas. Very fortunately for us, historians who, as I said, were sometimes unfashionable, science has now caught up with us. As science, if you like, is on our side, because science, and neuroscientists in particular, now tell us that we are physiologically creatures of memory. So as humans, we hold memory right across our brains. It's not as though there's a sort of little chest of drawers of memories that we choose to pull out. Memory is everywhere. And in fact, we can't have a future idea. We can't have a new thought without accessing a memory of either an experience or a thought or of some kind. So we need memories as the foundation for the future, as the foundation for future thinking. And therefore, if we deny memory, if we deny history, at a molecular level, we are denying our potential. We're cauterizing what it is to be human. So memory matters. And one of the things that I love about Odysseus and his world, that this was a world that really recognized that memory mattered and that the memory makers had status and standing. So these were the men, I think generally men, we don't find many women doing this, who would join together with great crowds of aristocrats and others living in citadels as a shared experience to talk about the memories of the past, to remind us that history reminds us to remember, to think better, that history, as I said, is a kind of a well of information and inspiration that we can use. And we've got a rather beautiful illustration of this from the Bronze Age palace at Pylos, so-called Nestos Palace, Nestor being another of the characters in the Trojan War story. And a fragment of a wall painting at Nestos Palace shows a man sitting with a lyre or a kithara, a stringed instrument, singing the stories of old, sharing the tales. And there's a rather beautiful image that a bird is flying away, and we think this is probably the bird of poetry and inspiration, the kind of muse of ideas leaving the singer's mouth and going to those who are collected around to hear what he has to say. Nestos Palace, I should just tell you as an aside, is one of the places I've visited on my own Odyssey recently, because there is really, really extremely exciting excavation and archaeology nearby to Nestos Palace at the moment. It's already an amazing site. I mean, this was a real party palace 3,500 years ago. So in one particular room, there are over, I think it's 2,800 particular kinds of kailikes, wine cups. We know that hundreds of animals are brought in for feasting, and these are feasts that involve wine. We probably think some form of opiates as well, and where really there was this kind of sense of communality and common purpose. So quite a place. And as I said, the excavations around there are revealing these extraordinary warrior graves, beautiful, beautiful, some of them untouched graves full of remarkable treasures, fine gold rings, the largest gold signet ring that's ever been found from the Bronze Age, beautiful carved agate seal stones, and the warriors' paraphernalia. So it's a very dynamic and exciting place to visit. And as I said, I also love Nestos Palace because this is where we see the bard, we see the keeper of memory heralded and celebrated on the walls of the palace. So Bards were a huge part of the world of Odysseus, of the Bronze Age world. As I said, these were people who passed on stories and information and understanding, because even though the thread of history might sometimes snap, we might sometimes get a break in recorded history, the thread of the storytelling of history, the stories of the past, the once upon a time moments, is never broken. That is something that as a species we continually do. We understand the world by the stories that we tell about it and about ourselves. We are creatures of memory. We are also storytelling creatures, and so we have to try to dig into those stories to find what value they are for us in the 21st century. So we remember Odysseus. He was often talked about by those bards of old. He was kind of set into the, if you like, into the kind of recipe of what it is to be a culture and to be a civilization. And we give him validity by remembering him now. The very fact that we remember his story means he is of importance to us. But on my own Odyssey, of course, I wasn't just remembering, I was trying to act out the story of Odysseus. And I said, you know, believe you me, there were quite a few adventures along the way. We were chased down by an earthquake in Odysseus's home island of Ithaka. Poseidon was the Greek god of earthquake, so we felt that he was still chasing us, as famously he chased Odysseus throughout the Odyssey. We had an extremely lively journey on the Icarian Sea, named after Icarus, the boy who disobeyed his father and flew up to the sun in wings made of feather and wax, with his father saying, don't fly too high, don't fly too high, they'll melt. But this is a young boy, you know, who has all that ambition of youth. He flies, the wax melts, and he plunges to his death in the sea. The Icarian Sea is named after him. And we hear from Homer in the Iliad that the Icarian Sea rages like a mob roused by demagogues. And so we thought we'd experienced it ourselves. My goodness, we were lucky to get out of that sea alive. So it was in itself truly an Odyssey, truly an adventure. But that is very appropriate for the story of Odysseus, because the story of Odysseus and his story is the story of challenge. It's the story of humankind in the world, the challenges that are thrown unexpectedly in the path of our heroes, and we watch and learn from the way that they deal with those challenges with wit and will and wisdom. So in a sense, the Odyssey, I believe, is the story of mankind. And we're given that clue right at the very beginning of this extraordinary poem, this poem which runs 12,110 lines. The Iliad is 15,693 lines. So these things were themselves great works of memory, of bardic memory, because they weren't written down. The bards were remembering these. So just listen to the opening lines of the Odyssey, where we're told that this really is a story about humankind. Tell me about a complex man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost, when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. So it's a story about Odysseus and his journey and the trials and tribulations that he has along his way. But the next line reveals to us that this is going to be a story with real jeopardy, because we're told that he doesn't succeed and that all his companions die. So it's not a comfortable tale. The Odyssey is often compared to the Iliad. The Iliad is full of guts and gore and viscera. It's visceral in every sense of the word. And the Odyssey is often described as a story of myths and monsters and beautiful women, as if it's a kind of light work. It's not a light work. There's still a lot of brutality in the Odyssey. And my goodness, that is appropriate to the real world of the Bronze Age. On this recent trip, I saw images that I'll never forget of young 19-year-old boys. Again, we're talking about young men who are 3,500 years old now. So looking at their skeletal remains. And this one young boy, in fact, from Athens, has his skull pierced at the base by a lead a lead missile of some kind, a slingshot, which has gone into his skull with the force of a bullet. His cranium has then suffered a terrible blow, which was probably the killer blow. Elsewhere, I look at bone evidence from this period, and you see towering men whose shins have been split by carrying these tower shields that we hear about again in the Iliad and the Odyssey, these huge shields. You also see them in frescoes on the palaces from this time. We're told that Ajax, the great warrior, Ajax carried one, but they would have banged against your shins, and we see that in the bone evidence. I've seen both young men and women who've had arrows through the sockets of their eyes, which have either been pulled out or extracted in some way, but that isn't what's killed them. They've then been pushed back out to fight. And we're also finding from the Bronze Age frequent examples of people with these little first aid kits, these kind of medicine bags that they carried with them, containing linen and opiates to try to deal with wounds, and possibly even, we think, mouldy bread, which would have had a natural penicillin on it. So this was a kind of, in many ways, a very traumatized world. It was a world that was both brilliant and beautiful. It was edging towards stability, and both very unstable too. So what you have is the Mycenaean Greek Empire, loosely in the west, up to the edges of the Eastern Mediterranean. You have the Hittite Empire in what is modern day Turkey and across into the Middle East. And then you have the great famous ancient Egyptian Empire as well. So you have these three circling one another like giant tomcats, and then within those kind of superpower clashes, you also have tribal conflicts of these warrior kings who are bristling with energy and brio and wanting to make their own citadel the most powerful in the region. And it really was a time when these individual heroes were singularly heroic. So even though they have armies, they have hosts of slaves, and it's one of the very upsetting things in this time when you look at these military campaigns and the number of women and men who are taken on campaign as slaves or serfs. So they have a huge kind of pyramid of support beneath them. But these individuals write to one another personal letters as if they're brothers. My brother, they say, I wish that you'd not invaded that particular land. I wish that you'd brought more gifts when you came to see me. I would like you to marry my younger sister, the princess, brother. So they're very, very, very personal, the relationship. So you can understand why what we hear of from this time is that this is a time filled with heroes, because in a way these singular men, these kings and aristocrats and tribal warriors were really the summation of all the ambition and purpose and power of that extraordinary age. So it is a brutal age. But what's fascinating and really relevant, I think, about the story of Odysseus is that Odysseus wins out in his world not just through brawn, but through brain. Time and time again, we hear that it's his wit, it's his wily ideas, his skill, his double thinking, his lateral thinking that has won the day, his clever, terrible tricks. Because, of course, it's Odysseus who comes up with this extraordinary idea to build a giant wooden horse that's going to be left at the gates of Troy as if it's some offering from the gods. And we know, the reader, we know that within that wooden horse are contained the warriors of the Greeks who are going to enter the city under the cover of the horse, break out and finally break this 10-year siege of Troy. So throughout these stories, we know that it is the mind of Odysseus that is winning out. So it's a very interesting development, that, and I'm sure that there is a reason for that this is a time when society itself is thinking, okay, well, we can have the bigger army, the sharper weapons in this kind of arms race of the Bronze Age, but maybe there's another way of doing things. Maybe there's a more diplomatic way of achieving our aims. Maybe we should allow for the kind of brilliance of the mind as well as the brilliance of our army and the gold in our citadels to impress those around us. So Odysseus is definitely the incarnation of the power of thought interestingly as well as the hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is in fact the oldest narrative poem that we have in existence from further east, from the Middle East, with the hero Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh too uses his mind and his wit and his wisdom to get out of sticky situations. So it's an interesting moment in the story of mankind. It is, though, also a time which is red in tooth and claw. And I mentioned this poor young man who had died in warfare with the slingshot wound at the back of his head and the blunt instrument on his cranium. He was probably only 19. And this is actually very, very typical. So this is a time when people are generally dead by the age of 35 or 36, often 25 or so. And we think they're probably on the battlefield age 14, 15 or 16. So although we might imagine this age as this rather sort of kind of fabulously stately, grizzled moment, in fact, it's a time of real juvenile teenage energy, if you like, which, dare I say, might possibly be one of the reasons that women are so present in a very sexual way in these myths and stories. If you think of the story of Odysseus alone and the women he encounters, so we have Circe, the so-called witch, who is a mistress of potions, who manages to enchant Odysseus's men, to turn them into swine, to seduce Odysseus himself, and we're told that he actually had a child with Circe. There's another quasi-goddess, Calypso. Her name means hidden. So we're supposed to kind of assume that there are hidden depths, probably hidden dangers to this woman. And Odysseus stays on Calypso's island for 7 years, making love every night. We're told this is a terrible drag, and he sits on the beach and weeps for his wife Penelope and wishes that he was back home with her. You know, you have to take that with a slight pinch of salt. So there's Calypso and Circe, but there is, of course, also the Sirens, the famous Sirens, these female creatures who are more bird, really, than they are woman. And the Sirens have these beautifully sweet voices and lure men to death on the rocks with the sound of their singing. Very interesting what happens with Odysseus in the story of the Sirens, because he knows that he's passing them by. He knows that he can't risk his sailors being lured to their deaths. So he plugs their ears with beeswax. We have brilliant Greek pots that show this, and he gets them to lash him to the mast so that he can hear, but he isn't going to be able to follow the siren call. So, by the way, sirens, these mythical creatures, give us our police sirens and ambulance sirens and fire sirens that we have today. And I think what we're being told in that story is that we can expose ourselves to temptations, but we should always try to put something in place so that we don't follow those temptations, so we are able to resist. And these are the ropes that tie Odysseus. So there are these kind of fantastical creatures, female creatures, very dangerous, deathly often. Of course, the Medusa, whose fierce eyes turn men to stones, often shown with snakes for hair. The female Scylla and Charybdis, these terrible whirlpools and rocks, which again draw men to their deaths. But the main female presence in the story of the Odyssey, and of course the Iliad, sort of hovering beneath the surface, often like a kind of beautiful, benign virus, is the world's desire, the queen of the world, the most beautiful woman in the world, Aurea Eleni in Greek, beautiful Helen, Helen of Troy. Because, of course, the whole reason that Odysseus is on his Odyssey is because of Helen of Troy, because we're told that Helen eloped with the Trojan prince Paris when her husband Menelaus was away in Crete at a funeral. And the Greek sources make it very clear that a hero race of godlike men destroyed themselves for rich, tressed Helen's sake. They follow Helen across the sea and fight for her for these 10 devastating years outside Troy. So Helen, you know, is not an entirely sympathetic character, I think we can say, in these stories. In a way, she's the incarnation of this notion that eros, love and desire, and eris, strife are very, very close partners. There is actually a goddess, Eris, a goddess of strife, who appears in the Greek myths, and we see her represented on pots. She's really the archetypal bad fairy, so she's there with these extraordinary black wings and black pointy boots. And the story of Eris is that there was a great society wedding. Anyone who was anyone was there, whether they were mortal or immortal, because this was the wedding of the king Peleus to Thetis, the nymph, the mother of Achilles. They've done a terrible thing, though. We all know that weddings are hard, and Peleus and Thetis have left Eris, the goddess of strife, off the guest list. And I would suggest she is the one person you do not forget to invite. Eris turns up anyway at this wedding, bursts in through the doors. Again, this is very similar to the Sleeping Beauty fairy tale, and we think that the story of Eris is the original version of the Sleeping Beauty tale. She bursts in through the doors at the wedding, throws down a golden apple, a very clever little act of destabilization, because written on this golden apple are the words, "For the fairest." And don't forget, all the great queens and aristocrats and goddesses are there. So who's going to choose who is the fairest in that room? The story unravels rather brilliantly. Zeus, the king of the gods, who has very little backbone in his situations, says, I couldn't possibly choose. So he sends his messenger off to try to attract the attention of the young Prince Paris, Helen's future lover, who at this point is just minding his own business on a hillside as a goat herd. And the messenger Hermes turns up and says, a great honour has been bestowed on you. You have to choose who is the fairest of all the goddesses. And there's rather a brilliant vase in Paris, the place, as opposed to Paris, the prince, in Paris, in the Louvre in Paris, where Paris, the prince, realises this is an impossible task, and you just see his kind of leg disappearing off the side of the painting. But he has to choose, and the goddesses turn up to tempt him. So Athena turns up and says, I will give you absolute prowess in war. Hera, the goddess, turns up and says, I will give you dominion over the known earth. And Aphrodite, the goddess of love and sexual desire, recognising that Paris is merely a 15-year-old or so boy, simply, we're told, loosens her girdle and bats her eyelashes and says, all I can give you is the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy. And Paris, being a young lad, we're told, chooses Helen, and then we're on set for the rest of the story. The rest is history, as they say. We know that he is then going to go and seduce Helen. So Helen has this very contested, charged story. She's trouble right from the very start. But I think there's something really fascinating about the story of Helen, because actually, if you look at the detail of the story as given to us by Homer, in the Iliad, and at moments in the story of her time as Queen of Sparta, she isn't just a femme fatale. She is a dignified, resourceful queen. She recognises that a terrible punishment has been sent on her to be the song of singers for generations to come. And I think what's being remembered are the real aristocratic women of that time who have really remarkable status and standing. I don't think this was a matriarchy. I don't think that women were in charge, but I do think that they had heft and weight. Just a couple of tiny examples from the archaeology. So we know that women had what are called onato in the early Greek tablets, which are portions of land. So we know that they are land owners. It seems that they could bequeath land, so they held the rights to land, which again makes sense if you think of Helen's story, because Helen is in charge of the territory of Sparta. In order to gain that territory, the great heroes of the day have to come and fight and race in order to try to win her hand. Agamemnon actually wins and passes her over to his brother Menelaus. But again, that makes sense when you look at what's actually going on, and if you look at how they're dealt with when they're buried. These women, they are have remarkable wealth. We know that they were described as clauephoroi, which were the keepers of the keys of the stores of grain. And if you think about this time, everything depends on those stores of grain. We know this from biblical stories that if the grain stores fail, then famine is really only only a couple of seasons, possibly even only a season away. So this is a really, really important job. So the fact that Helen has this central role in the story, I think, as I said, is actually remembering the central role that a number of aristocratic women had at the time. So it's one of those moments where myth and history graze. And although Homer is not a historian, he's a fabulist, he's a storyteller. It's almost as if with some of the details that he gives us, he's giving us history by accident. Helen's described as having a golden spindle, and we found a golden spindle in the burial of one aristocratic woman from this time. And a lot of people often say to me, could this actually have happened? Could there have been some kind of diplomatic incident where the infidelity of an aristocratic woman or a queen caused a war? And the answer is absolutely 100% yes. So we know from these really interesting Hittite tablets, so we're talking around 1260 BCE, so around 3,200 odd years ago. They're very boring, these tablets. They're bits of kind of legalese, you know, they aren't grand epic tales, but they tell of a conflict between the states of Ugarit and Amuru over the behaviour of a young woman, and the kind of implication is that she's been sent over in a kind of diplomatic marriage alliance and something has gone wrong. She's possibly had an affair with somebody in the other court, and the Hittite negotiators, the great superpowers, the Hittite lords of this area, have been brought in as negotiators. So there you are. I'm not saying that is Helen, but that is Helen's story. So her kind of influence as far more than just a trophy wife is very pertinent, and is something I think that is remembered in the story of the women surrounding Odysseus in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. So women, I think, have real power, and something which brought this home to me in a very shocking, quite disturbing way during my own Odyssey recently was access to a new dig site on Crete, on the island of Crete, in the town of Chania, ancient Kydonia. And there we were taken to the site of a palace, again from around 1250 BCE, and it's a mansion, and there's been an earthquake, and you can actually see the earthquake damage. So the floor is split, and following the earthquake, there have been terrible fires, as there often are, because you have stores of olive oil in these mansions and palaces. They're explosively flammable olive oil, and quite often when they catch fire, the heat is so strong that you see the floor beneath them has vitrified. It's turned to glass. So this would have been a terrible event. And at the edge of the wall, where there have been where you can see the earthquake splits, there's been a huge sacrifice. A sacrifice of animals, so 43 sheep or goat, 4 pigs, 2 cows, but also the sacrifice of a young woman. So there is a young woman's skull there. It's very clear from the cut marks that she's been decapitated. And post-death, almost certainly, her skull has been torn apart. We imagine as the earth was torn apart. So we think this is the example of human sacrifice, possibly the sacrifice of a young girl to try to appease the gods. It's a terrible thing. It's very macabre. It's very, very draining and difficult to look at this young girl and to think of her fate. But this was a different time. And the word sacrifice means to make something sacred. And what would be being offered up to the gods would be the thing which mattered most to that civilization, the most valuable thing they had. And isn't it interesting that that is a young woman? And immediately when I saw that skull and that sacrifice site, you think of the stories that we hear from the Iliad and the Odyssey of the young Princess Iphigenia, Agamemnon's own daughter, who is sacrificed by her father because the gods are offended, Artemis in particular, and there is no wind. So he's told that he has to sacrifice his first fruit, his most precious thing, his young daughter, to try to win back the favour of the gods. Again, it's a very difficult passage to read, and this happens with Polyxena later on in the Trojan War story, who either commits suicide or is somehow killed and again sacrificed on the tomb of Achilles. So it's something which we hear about in the literature and that we also see in the archaeology. So these myths are very powerful because they're in a sense guiding us to truths, both philosophical and physical, to kind of bigger truths about the story of the world then and now, and to practical, quotidian, daily details of life in this incredibly influential moment in the story of mankind. So myths matter, and the Greeks and ancient societies, they knew that myths mattered too. A mythoi, a collection of myths, doesn't mean a fairy tale. It doesn't mean a fanciful thing. It means ideas that are shared and transmitted, ideas with purpose, points of information. So ideas that need to be remembered, that need to be brought to wider attention. So as I said, this Odyssey was an extraordinary thing, really. It taught me even more, I said, about the kind of practical clues to life that we get from these stories, that Icarians see as dangerous now as it was then, the fact of virgin sacrifice, even kind of myths like Atlantis, which again are much debated about whether these are real or entire fabrications. But if you look at the story of Atlantis carefully, this by the way is, we hear about Atlantis from Plato. I'm jumping forward by 1,000 years. We don't hear about Atlantis in the Iliad or the Odyssey. Plato actually writes about it as a kind of moral allegory. But if you look at the details of the story of Atlantis, there's extraordinary, powerful, confident civilization that is rather hubristic, that is rather proud, and then is swallowed up by the sea. A lot of those details seem to me to relate very, very, very precisely to the extraordinary Bronze Age town of Akrotiri on Thera, the island of Thera, now also called Santorini, which is one giant volcano, and that we know, we think in 1615 BCE, exploded with extraordinary force. I mean, if you look at the seabed around Santorini, 35 kilometers away, there is still extruded volcanic material. Everybody within 100 miles would have immediately gone deaf from the explosion. The ash cloud was so great that tree growth as far away as Ireland was stunted. So this was a huge, huge event. And on the island of Thera itself, buried under meters worth of pumice and ash, are these beautiful cities. It's been described as the Pompeii of the Aegean. I mean, I don't really think that does it justice. I think it's almost more extraordinary than Pompeii, because we're talking about a Bronze Age civilization with these beautiful houses with kind of earthquake engineering, wonderful open windows, exquisite paintings and frescoes and beautiful objects, little beds, little tables and stools that look like kind of Louis XIV's furniture. And all of this was destroyed in a terrible day and a night by the eruption of Thera. And the details that we hear from Plato are that this was a city built in red, black and white stone. That's exactly the stone that you get on Thera. The ocean became impassable, and we know that after that eruption there would have been feet deep, about 10 feet deep of pumice that would indeed have made the ocean impassable. So I think that these are stories which are so important. They're events that happened. It would be more extraordinary if a myth wasn't invented about them, if they weren't remembered, than if they were lost to time. So as I said, these myths are kind of key. Sometimes they help us try to look for the reality, to try to prove myths is a specious exercise, but they are allies in our task for searching for history. So myths matter, as I said, for reasons both great and small, because they can guide us to history. But I think particularly because they help us explore who we are, what we do on Earth, and how we should behave. That Odyssey, for me, drew all kinds of parallels with the story of Odysseus. We know that Odysseus only survives because he often relies on the help and kindness of strangers. And this is the theme that runs throughout the Odyssey. There's a Greek word for it, which is Zenia, which is the welcoming of strangers as though they're friends, of allowing guests across your threshold. It's got a very interesting early root, which is gosti, a Proto-Indo-European word, G-H-O-S-T-I, which gives us the English words via a Germanic root, guest and host, which is originally the same word, this idea that if you were a guest, you should be a host and vice versa. And Gosti and Zenia are really kind of the foundations of culture, I think, this notion that we sometimes have to take risks, we sometimes have to allow the unknown across our threshold. And the notion in the ancient Greek world was that the gods were constantly disguising themselves as humans, so even if a beggar came to your door, you would have to treat them with respect and let them in, because that could be Zeus in disguise. And this is exactly what happens to Odysseus time and again. So it's a story of Zenia, of the power of guest-host friendship, of welcoming the new, the unknown, physically across our thresholds into our homes, but also kind of mentally to allowing the new into our minds. We experienced it to the power of X, even when there was this earthquake that I mentioned on Ithaka, on Odysseus's home island. The next morning, the grandmother who was hosting us still got up at 6 o'clock to make fresh milk pies. So that was Zenia in action, if you like. So collaboration is a very important theme of the Odyssey. Zenia is the notion that home is where love is, that home is somewhere that is worth going through hell and high water to return to. And these homecomings are called nostoi in Greek, which gives us our word nostalgia. And nostalgia, I think, is a rather unhelpful word because it makes us think of something which is rather sweet and saccharine, that we're sort of looking back through rose-tinted spectacles at things that have gone before. But I think through this COVID crisis, we've all realised that nostalgia has real heft and weight, that nostalgia is yearning for the things that matter, yearning for the things that have substance and tenacity and weight and meaning, that are not simply ephemeral. And again, the nostoi, the homecomings, is really one of the kind of central themes of the Odyssey. But as I said right at the very beginning of this brief talk, is what it really is about. The Odyssey is the story of man, and I mean man in its broadest sense, and use that word very carefully, as in the story of mankind, because the word man, very interestingly, comes from a very, very early prehistoric root, manu, which means mind. So a man is not a male thing, a man is a thinking thing like Odysseus, a creature who uses brain, not brawn, to survive. And we're given that clue in the very next line, right at the very opening of the Odyssey. Launch out on Odysseus's story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. And Muses, by the way, the Muses are the daughters of Zeus and of Memory. So Memory is the mother of the Muse. Start from where you will, sing of his time and for our time too. Or in a slightly different translation, this translation by Emily Wilson, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. And that, I think, really is the message of the Odyssey. Find the beginning. look back through time, because the wonderful thing about history is that it literally gives us all the time in the world to think. And stories like the Odyssey remind us to care about people, about men and women who we have never known, who we can never meet across time and space, but they matter to us. To slightly misquote the poet Wordsworth, we might have different faces, but we all share one human heart. So for me, that extraordinary exploration, the Odyssey, both ancient and my own 21st century Odyssey, taught me one thing, that it is our minds that connect us. It is our minds that we should cherish and nurture and nourish, because I think, and therefore I am, part of the brotherhood of man. Thank you. See you in person in Australia soon.
Dismissing the past denies who and what we are at a molecular level as a species. That thought will certainly stay with me. I'm sure you'll agree that it's been a privilege to have Professor Bettany Hughes as our guest speaker on this occasion. So let me say to her on your behalf how much we have appreciated it. And for those of you thinking, wouldn't it have been wonderful to hear and meet her in person and perhaps even follow up with some questions, I can only say, keep your fingers crossed and take note of what she said at the beginning about being with us in Australia once COVID permits. Meanwhile, thank you for listening. Please join us again soon. This is Simon Haynes saying goodbye for now.